Considered by most of the Star Trek fanbase to be one of the worst Star Trek The Next Generation episodes, Code of Honor would be called everything from unwatchable to absolutely racist television. But what's the story behind this episode? Well, in today's episode of Backtrack, we'll find out. With Star Trek The Next Generation greenlit and production underway, many writers were approached by Gene Roddenberry to flesh out stories for his new iteration of Star Trek. Catherine Powers and Michael Barron were chosen to write this particular episode. Originally, the concept of this episode would see the Ligonians, named the Talisians, a reptilian species with a culture similar to the Japanese samurai and a warrior caste called the Kadam. The story concept also named the planet Tellus, as opposed to Ligon 2, and Luton was actually an important captain of the Talisian ship who had great influence on his home world. He meets the Enterprise D crew while they're on shore leave on a planet where ritual fightings were commonplace. Luton still kidnaps Lieutenant Tasha Yar, where on this planet she then has to fight Luton's son. This concept also featured a reference to Captain James T. Kirk, who apparently would have once fought Luton's grandfather. Urina's uncle was the king of Tellus, and also was poisoned by Luton. And the away team of the Enterprise D was to be imprisoned, where they would meet Hinon, a nephew of Luton, who would help them eventually escape. This story was a far cry from what we actually got. Catherine Powers has written numerous scripts for television since 1974. Interestingly, she was also the writer for the Stargate episode Emancipation. Both episodes featured a female officer being abducted and later having to participate in a fight to the death, which both parties end up surviving. And both episodes were also widely criticized, not only by the fans, but also by the cast as well. She also wrote the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Past Prologue, a much better outing for her in my opinion. Michael Barron, on the other hand, was one of those writers who only wrote this episode. And maybe it's this episode's critical failure that would lead him to decide never to write again. Russ Mayberry was hired to direct this episode, and he was a very prolific television director, directing everything from episodes of The Monkees to Magnum P.I. and The $6 Million Man. During filming of this episode, however, Mayberry left production, and the first assistant director, Les Landau, took over in his absence. It is unclear the reason Mayberry left. Many people have speculated that it was due to Gene Roddenberry's interference in the show, and the absolutely racist nature of the script, but I could find no evidence of either reason. Unfortunately, we may never know the true answer to this conundrum, as Russ Mayberry died on July 27, 2012, from an unspecified brief illness at Fort Collins Medical Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. Generally speaking, Season 1 of TNG is cited as its worst. Sure, it had a few good episodes, but per capita, most were underwhelming or just downright bad. A lot of the Star Trek fan base, in more recent years, has put this down to Gene Roddenberry himself, who had seemed to have fallen into the trap of believing his own propaganda and forgetting what the core of Star Trek really was. Some of the production team on this episode even cite Roddenberry as being erratic in regards to rules for the writers, and what they were allowed to do or not to do. For example, in the episode The Last Outpost, Herbert J. Wright wrote a scene that the Enterprise was to fire warning shots at the Ferengi ship. Gene Roddenberry said absolutely not to this, and the great Captain Picard would never resort to violence to solve a problem, and so the warning shots were removed from that script. However, in Code of Honor, Roddenberry himself would end up writing in a scene where Picard fires torpedoes above the planet's surface, completely contradicting what he had previously stated. This type of thing definitely sent mixed messages, and most likely contributed to TNG's first season being so lackluster. One of the major problems with this episode is the fact that most people view it as being outright racist, and I must admit I avoid watching it partly because of that fact. In this episode, the entire planet's population is played by African Americans. However, this was not the writer's original intentions at all. In fact, the original teleplay had only Luton's bodyguards as African American. I tried to find out why the entire population of the planet was changed to African Americans, but came up with merely a lot of rumors and supposition. But from what I can tell, it was actually a simple case of miscommunications between casting and production staff. The cast themselves were not really impressed by this episode one bit. Jonathan Frakes referred to Code of Honor as a racist piece of shit. The worst and most embarrassing episode we made, and one that even Gene Roddenberry should have been embarrassed by. Brent Spiner also regarded this episode as TNG's worst, saying it was just a racist episode. Maybe not intentionally, but it sure felt and looked that way. Michael Dorn and LeVar Burton have both publicly cited this episode as the worst Star Trek episode ever made. Star Trek The Next Generation companion writer Tracy Torme was embarrassed by what he called a 1940s tribal Africa view of Africans in this episode, and he was very offended by it. Code of Honor's first story outline was submitted on March 6, 1987, and the final draft being completed on July 2, 1987. Filming for this episode commenced on July 15th and ended on July 24th, 1987. Music for this episode was scored by Fred Steiner, who had written numerous scores for Star Trek the Original Series. If you've watched TOS, then chances are you've heard a lot of Steiner's music. And although not special effects intensive, Robert Legato has publicly stated that this episode actually had 80 visual special effects shots that had to be created. Code of Honor premiered on October 12, 1987, and immediately the fans' backlash began. I remember fellow Star Trek fans arguing about how bad it was and how it strayed so far from what Star Trek as a show should be. And personally, I have yet to meet a Star Trek fan that truly loved this episode. I'm sure they're out there, and I'm sure in the comments section I'll now get a bunch of fans that say they do or did, but in all my years involved in the Star Trek communities online and in real life, I've never run across one yet. When you have so many people angry and unimpressed by an episode that even the actors of the show hated, then you know there's a problem. Thankfully, however, this episode's horrible nature would be chalked up to early TNG trying to find its footing, and would not end up being indicative of the series or the franchise. If it had, I doubt TNG would have lasted very long, and certainly in today's day and age, it would have been cancelled shortly after its airing. Do I believe it's as bad as everyone thinks it is? I do. I don't think it's just the racist qualities within the episode, however. I think it's the whole package. The story itself is terribly underwhelming, and the writers were way off base when it came to Star Trek's fundamental core. Something which would be prevalent throughout the first and second seasons of TNG. But by season 3, with Gene Roddenberry stepping back and Maurice Hurley being axed, Star Trek The Next Generation would become a fan-favorite Star Trek series, and earn its place in Star Trek history.
Next time on Star Trek The Next Generation.
You must get the vaccine from the planet, Captain, immediately.
On a desperate life-saving mission, Lieutenant Yar falls prey to kidnappers.
Proton torpedoes ready, sir.
Fire.
You shall have no vaccine and no Lieutenant Yar!
And the deadly trade-off begins.
I challenge you. A struggle to the death.
It's a fight for survival on Star Trek The Next Generation.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little trip behind the scenes of Code of Honor. What did you think of the episode? Do you agree with the fandom view of it at large? Well, leave me a comment in the section below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. Want to help the channel out behind the scenes? Then consider becoming a channel patron. The link to our Patreon account is in the description below. And just to be thorough, I've included the Code of Honor's excerpt from my Star Trek The Next Generation Season 1 Part 1 Mistakes video to complete this backtrack episode. So I hope you enjoy. Thanks again for watching. Live long and prosper. After Luton kidnaps Yar, the crew of the Enterprise are basically running around like chickens with their heads cut off trying to figure out what to do. In all of this, no one suggests the most obvious course of action, locking onto Yar's comm badge and beaming her back. In Encounter at Farpoint, Picard describes the functions on the right side panel of the captain's chair.
The panel on your right is for log entries, library computer access, retrieval, view screen control, and intercom, so on.
Which includes the ship's intercom system. However, in this episode, Picard reaches for the left side of his chair to use the intercom. During the scene where LaForge and Data are discussing the human condition while LaForge shaves, watch LaForge's razor. It jumps around furiously. Just before the battle between Yar and Urena begins, the rules for the combat are said aloud. One of the rules include that combat would not be stopped until someone had won.
I speak for Lutan. The rules are known. Let combat continue until there is a victor.
Why then does Luton stop the fight when Urena loses her weapon? First, isn't that a common occurrence in hand-to-hand combat? Second, isn't that going totally against his goal of obtaining Urena's land and property? When combating, both Yar and Urena have their weapons on their left hand. Why then, when beamed aboard the Enterprise, is Yar's weapon suddenly on her right hand?